The night was quiet, almost deceptively calm, when the first alerts began lighting up the palace corridors. Phones buzzed frantically, security teams scrambled, and aides whispered in urgent, hushed tones. But none of this chaos mattered more than the single truth that had just landed like a bombshell. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, was about to be stripped of every royal title, honor, and privilege. Have you ever imagined what it would feel like to lose everything that defined your identity overnight? For Harry, that moment had just arrived, and now he was boarding an emergency flight back to the United Kingdom. But why? Why now, after years of controversy, exile, and public drama? And what exactly had the palace discovered that triggered this unprecedented royal order? These questions weren't just rumors swirling in the tabloids. Sources inside the palace confirmed the gravity of the situation, and tonight, the story was unfolding in real time. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine sitting in a private jet, engines humming, the dim cabin lights casting shadows over your tense face. The news has hit you like a freight train. The king has ordered you stripped of your titles. The privileges you were born into, the security you've relied on, even the public perception you've carefully curated, gone. It's not just symbolic. It's a legal, formal, and public declaration that changes your life forever. Every royal connection you've leveraged, every handshake with dignitaries, every carefully managed appearance, all at risk. And yet, the world outside your window remains oblivious to the storm you are hurtling toward. The press, the public, your own family. They are all about to witness a royal reckoning unlike anything in living memory. For the past decade, Harry has lived in a constant balancing act between duty and defiance. From the headlines of Megxit to the Netflix deals that shook the monarchy, to explosive interviews and legal battles, the Duke has always been a figure of fascination and controversy. But tonight, all of that past tension boiled to a single, unavoidable confrontation. The palace had gathered evidence, carefully and secretly, detailing actions and communications that could no longer be ignored. For years, Harry may have thought he could navigate the storm of public scrutiny and family disappointment. But the truth, as the palace now revealed, was unavoidable. Aides moved quickly, gathering confidential files and rushing them through the labyrinthine corridors of Buckingham Palace. Phones were ringing, messages were being sent to top security personnel, and an emergency meeting of senior officials was convened in the hidden rooms behind the gilded walls. The king, calm but resolute, was making decisions that would shake the royal institution itself. He wasn't angry in the way the tabloids might suggest. His actions were deliberate, measured, and informed by decades of experience. And yet, there was no hiding the tension in the air. Every aide, every officer, every family member in those secret chambers felt the weight of history pressing down. What happens when a prince defies the crown to the point where the monarchy itself must intervene? The answer, tonight, was unfolding with every passing second. Now, Harry's private jet was taxiing on the runway. The engines roared, but inside, the hum of anxiety was louder than the mechanical vibrations. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. There were no cameras here, no public scrutiny. Only the realization that the most private, personal, and potentially humiliating confrontation of his life was moments away. And yet, the Duke could not help but reflect on the choices that had brought him to this moment. Each scandal, each rebellion against royal convention, each public disclosure had led him here. Some would call it karma, others, tragedy. But no matter how it was framed, the facts were undeniable. The palace had acted, and there was no turning back. Meanwhile, the public had begun to sense that something extraordinary was happening. Social media accounts buzzed with speculation. Private messages circulated among royal commentators. By the time Harry's flight lifted off, whispers of the palace strike were already leaking online, setting the stage for a media frenzy. The tension between the controlled secrecy of the palace and the unstoppable curiosity of the public had never been more pronounced. How would Harry respond? Would he attempt to negotiate, to plead his case, to appeal to old family bonds? Or would he face this storm head-on, defiant and unrepentant, trusting that the public narrative could be controlled in some way? Harry's thoughts were interrupted by the cold reality of security protocols. Only a handful of people were allowed on the flight with him, each chosen for loyalty, discretion, and competence. The rest of the world, media, friends, distant family, and even the public at large, were locked out. And yet, inside the cabin, the tension was palpable. Whispered conversations between aides hinted at just how severe the palace's evidence had been. Documents had been unearthed, communications reviewed, and decisions made that could not be undone. The Duke's reputation, legacy, and very identity as a royal were at stake. And all of this was about to collide in real time the moment he set foot back on British soil. But what made this emergency flight truly extraordinary was the timing. There had been no warning, no leaked memo, no opportunity to prepare a public statement or media narrative. The decision was abrupt, decisive, and unprecedented. A king had moved to enforce authority in a way that would leave no room for negotiation. For Harry, the realization of this reality was staggering. There was no longer a buffer between him and the consequences. Every scandal, every misstep, every choice he had made, both public and private, would now be weighed in the most unforgiving court imaginable, the royal family itself. As the jet ascended, leaving the muted lights of the tarmac behind, the Duke's mind raced. Would his family welcome him back? Would he be able to argue his case, to appeal to sentiment, to remind them of shared history and bloodlines? Or was this truly the end of his formal association with the crown? And yet, as the miles slipped by, there was also a strange calmness in knowing that the confrontation, when it came, would be inevitable. The suspense of waiting, the dread of stepping into a palace now fully armed with evidence and authority, was almost unbearable. And for the viewers following this story, the suspense was only beginning. Every element of this unfolding drama was loaded with tension. Security protocols, flight paths, media speculation, palace procedures, all of it combined into a moment of history in the making. The stakes were extraordinarily high, and the consequences for Harry could alter not just his life, but the perception of the monarchy itself. Public opinion, financial consequences, the line of succession, and royal authority were all on the line. And the clock was ticking. Every second brought the jet closer to Heathrow, and every second heightened the anticipation of what awaited him. And here's the most chilling part. Harry was not just returning to the UK as a visitor. He was returning to face a formal, irrevocable decision. A royal decree that would strip him of his privileges, his titles, and the identity that had defined him since birth. Can you imagine being told that everything you've inherited, everything you've fought for, and everything you thought you had earned could be taken away in a single stroke? The tension, the anxiety, the dread, it was all real, and it was all about to unfold before the eyes of the world. By the time the first wheels of the jet touched British soil, history would record an extraordinary moment, a prince returning not in triumph, but in crisis. And while the public, media, and royal watchers could only speculate on what would happen next, the truth was far more complex and far more explosive than anyone could have imagined. This was not just another royal scandal. This was a turning point that would shake the foundations of the monarchy itself. And the real story, the shocking details, were just beginning to emerge. The phone rang just as the clock in Buckingham Palace struck midnight. In the hushed corridors, it sounded like a gunshot, snapping aides awake from their tentative sleep. But this was no ordinary call. It carried the kind of urgency that could rewrite history. A senior aide picked up, and the words spoken on the other end sent an immediate shiver down their spine. It's Harry. The king's orders have arrived. He's to be stripped of all titles. Immediately, a flurry of activity erupted within seconds. Messages were sent to the palace's top security officers. Legal teams were pulled from their beds and briefed on the consequences of the impending royal decree. The words irreversible, official, and unprecedented circulated rapidly in the confidential channels. This was not speculation. This was not a rumor to be whispered behind closed doors. The Duke of Sussex was about to face the most severe personal and public reprimand any royal had endured in generations. In a small office near the heart of the palace, Harry's personal secretary stared at the notification blinking on her phone. Her mind raced. What could have prompted this sudden, dramatic escalation? They had all been aware of tension between the Duke and the Crown, but no one expected a decision of this magnitude, issued in the dead of night. Every step Harry had taken over the past decade, exiting royal duties, negotiating Netflix contracts, publicly revealing private family conflicts, had led to this moment. But the swiftness, the decisiveness, stunned even those closest to him. Meanwhile, in another part of London, Prince Harry himself was awake, pacing the floor of his London residence, phone clutched in his hand. The message had come directly from the palace. Board the emergency flight immediately. Security will escort you. Do not attempt to negotiate. Harry's mind spun in circles. Could this be a mistake? Was this a power play by someone inside the palace trying to intimidate him? Or was this truly the king's directive, a final, irreversible command? The thought that he might return to the UK not as a prince, but as a man stripped of every honor he had ever known made his stomach churn. He tried to calm himself, taking deep, measured breaths. Yet the panic was unavoidable. Every decision he had made in recent years, each interview, each public disclosure, now loomed over him with terrifying clarity. It was as if the walls of every palace he had ever known were closing in, and the past he had hoped to escape was now rushing to confront him. He sent quick, encrypted messages to his closest aides and friends, but even those texts carried a sense of urgency that could not be mitigated. This was not a negotiation. This was a decree that would determine his life forever. Back at Buckingham Palace, security teams mobilized with military-like precision. Aides coordinated with Scotland Yard and Royal Transportation units. The palace itself seemed to come alive in response to this one singular event. It was as if the entire institution recognized the historical weight of the moment. The first time a direct order to strip a senior royal of titles and privileges had been issued in modern history. Discussions were muted but tense. Every word, every action, every decision had to be calculated to avoid any misstep that could escalate the situation into public chaos or international scandal. The emergency flight, already arranged for moments like this, began to prepare for departure. The private jet that Harry would board was cleared, refueled, and staffed with only the most trusted personnel. Inside, security officers briefed Harry on what awaited him. A formal confrontation with the king, legal officers to document proceedings, and media contingencies in place to manage what was about to leak into the public domain. But even with all precautions, the Duke could feel the weight of scrutiny pressing down upon him. Every move, every breath, every second was under the watchful eye of not just the royal family, but the entire world. As Harry arrived at the airfield, the reality of the situation hit him in waves. The engines of the jet roared to life, yet the hum of anxiety inside him was louder than any mechanical noise. The aides around him were professional, yet the tension in their eyes betrayed the gravity of the moment. For all the years he had navigated scandals, for all the interviews and public appearances, nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing could. The king's orders were absolute, and the consequences of disobedience could extend beyond reputation into legal peril. During the flight, Harry tried to recollect the events that led to this point. He thought of past interviews, including those that criticized the royal family, and how they were now interpreted as evidence against him. He reflected on the media appearances, the Netflix deals, the public statements that had caused waves. Each action, once a form of personal liberation or rebellion, now loomed as a liability. And as the aircraft soared over the Atlantic, he realized that the palace had anticipated every potential defense, every excuse, every argument he could muster. They had compiled evidence, testimonies, and documents that made resistance nearly impossible. Meanwhile, in the palace, preparations continued. Legal advisors reviewed every conceivable contingency. Security personnel rehearsed protocols. Public relations teams crafted statements to release if and when information became public. The palace understood that the moment Harry landed, the world's eyes would be upon him, scrutinizing every gesture, every word, every decision. And the palace was ready. For them, this was not just a disciplinary measure. It was a demonstration of authority, a statement of sovereignty, and a warning to anyone who might challenge the institution again. In the cabin, Harry's thoughts turned inward. Could he reason with the king? Could he appeal to familial bonds? Or was this truly a moment where personal history, legacy, and loyalty collided in a way that left no room for negotiation? He felt a strange combination of anger, fear, and regret. The decisions that had once seemed small, the choice to speak out, to leave the royal fold, to challenge traditions, now felt monumental. Each past action had led him inexorably toward this emergency flight, this midnight confrontation, this moment when his very identity as a royal hung in the balance. The flight crew, aware of the heightened tension, tried to maintain calm, yet even they could not ignore the historical significance. They had transported dignitaries, celebrities, and politicians, but never had they been part of a moment with such profound personal and institutional stakes. Every minute closer to Heathrow felt like a countdown to history. Every mile traversed brought Harry closer to a confrontation that could redefine his life, the monarchy, and public perception of both. And then, as the jet began its descent into the London airspace, Harry looked out the window and felt a surge of dread. The familiar skyline, once comforting, now seemed alien, almost hostile. The city he had once walked through freely, the palace he had grown up in, the corridors of power he had once navigated with confidence, they all loomed like a gauntlet he had to run. Every eye, every camera, every whispering voice would be on him within minutes. And the palace had made it clear. No titles, no privileges, no special treatment. Harry would face the consequences fully, publicly, and irrevocably. This was the emergency call that had changed everything. The call that set in motion a sequence of events that would alter Harry's life forever. And while the flight might have seemed routine to an outside observer, inside, the storm was building with every passing second. The questions racing through his mind were countless. What would the king say? How would the palace execute the title stripping? What would the public think? Could he withstand the humiliation, the scrutiny, the betrayal? Or was this truly the end of the Duke of Sussex as a royal? By the time the jet touched down, the world was on the brink of witnessing an unprecedented moment in royal history. Security was on high alert, aides were poised, and Harry himself braced for the confrontation that could not be postponed. Every second that passed carried the weight of legacy, reputation, and identity. And the emergency call that had started it all, the call that summoned him back across the ocean in the dead of night, was only the beginning of a royal reckoning the likes of which Britain had never seen. The jet sat on the tarmac, engines already humming, lights piercing the dark London night. To any casual observer, it looked like another private flight preparing for takeoff. But inside, the tension was palpable, almost suffocating. This was no ordinary trip. This was an emergency mission, a race against time, and a journey into the eye of a storm that had been decades in the making. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, stepped out of the waiting car, face grim, posture tense. For the first time in years, he wasn't greeted by smiles or applause, only the rigid efficiency of the aides and security officers who would accompany him across the Atlantic. As he approached the jet, the flash of cameras from distant press lenses could be felt even in the shadows. Harry's security team, handpicked and briefed in secrecy, moved in synchrony, forming a protective wall around him. The Duke's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. Could this truly be happening? Was the palace really willing to strip him of everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, and everything he had inherited by birthright? The weight of the king's directive pressed on him, heavier than any physical burden he had ever known. Each step toward the aircraft felt like moving through a gauntlet, unseen yet unavoidable. Inside, the cabin was quiet, the atmosphere almost clinical in its precision. The security officers gave their briefings in low, measured tones. "Everything is prepared," one said. "The palace has instructed that this is to be handled efficiently. No deviations, no delays." Harry nodded, absorbing the words, though the meaning of efficiency weighed like lead in his chest. This was more than a flight. It was a carefully orchestrated operation designed to confront him with the consequences of his actions in real time. The palace had anticipated every potential response, every argument, every emotional plea. There was no room for negotiation, no room for hesitation. As the doors closed, Harry felt the finality of the moment. No turning back, no retreat, no escape. The engines roared to life, and the aircraft began to taxi down the runway. Each second felt elongated, stretched by anticipation. Harry reflected on the path that had led him here. Every interview, every public statement, every controversial move, each decision was now a thread woven into a tapestry of consequence that he could not unravel. He thought of his family, his father, his brother, the Queen, his wife, and his children. How would they perceive him in the aftermath of this unprecedented decree? How would the public respond? And most importantly, how would he face the king? The cabin crew maintained a professional demeanor, yet there was an unspoken awareness that this flight was unlike any other. They had transported diplomats, celebrities, and politicians, but never someone returning under the weight of such a severe royal directive. Every move, every glance, every gesture carried historical significance. The Duke's thoughts drifted to his childhood, to the corridors of Buckingham Palace where he had first learned the meaning of duty, loyalty, and expectation. He had grown up believing in a certain order, a structure that now seemed fragile, even brittle, in the face of this crisis. Outside, the London night stretched endlessly. The city lights blurred beneath the plane's ascent, casting fleeting shadows across Harry's tense expression. He considered the media narrative already forming, the social media speculation, and the inevitable headlines that would scream across screens worldwide. This wasn't just a personal confrontation. It was a public spectacle, a drama unfolding in real time before an audience of millions. And yet, in that moment, Harry felt alone, completely isolated from the public, from friends, and even from the family he had spent years navigating conflicts with. The first hours of the flight passed in near silence. Harry sat staring out the window, the lights of London fading behind him, while aides whispered quietly among themselves. His mind raced with the possible scenarios awaiting him. Would the king meet him personally upon arrival? Would there be legal officers present to enforce the title-stripping decree? Would the media be allowed into the palace grounds, waiting for a reaction? Every potential outcome seemed fraught with tension, every possibility more complex than the last. And yet, amid the anxiety, Harry's rebellious nature surfaced. He thought of ways to mitigate the damage, to regain some semblance of control, to perhaps argue his case once he returned. But he knew, deep down, that the palace had anticipated this. They had prepared, planned, and rehearsed every angle. Every move he might make had likely been considered in advance. The king's order was not a suggestion. It was a command backed by the full weight of royal authority and legal oversight. As the hours passed, Harry tried to focus on the practicalities of the flight. He reviewed documents, confirmed security details, and made brief calls to trusted confidants. Yet even these actions felt insufficient, almost trivial, compared to the storm he was hurtling toward. He remembered past controversies, interviews that had upset the family, the media storms that followed, the legal disputes over memoirs and documentaries. And he understood, with stark clarity, that those past events were no longer isolated incidents. They were part of a cumulative dossier that the palace was now presenting as justification for the unprecedented action being taken against him. Somewhere deep within the cabin, a quiet voice reminded him that this was not merely about titles or privileges. It was about authority, hierarchy, and the preservation of a centuries-old institution. The king's directive was as much a warning as it was a punishment. Defiance has consequences, and even a prince is not above the crown. Harry's mind wandered briefly to how the public might perceive this. Would they sympathize with him as a victim of royal rigidity, or would they see him as someone who had pushed boundaries too far? And perhaps most terrifyingly, how would history remember this moment? Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, dark and unyielding beneath the plane. Inside, Harry wrestled with his emotions, fear, anger, defiance, and regret, all coalescing into a storm that mirrored the one he was flying directly into. Every mile brought him closer to a confrontation that could define his legacy, his family relationships, and his very identity. And yet, in this cocoon of controlled chaos, he could not shake the sense that the palace's decision was absolute, immovable, and fully prepared to enforce itself upon his arrival. The crew, sensitive to the tension, maintained a professional detachment, but their eyes betrayed the extraordinary nature of this flight. They were witnesses to history in motion, and every adjustment, every whisper, every action carried weight. The cabin, once a symbol of comfort and privacy, now felt like a vessel carrying a man toward inevitable reckoning. Harry stared out the window again, watching the horizon, feeling the weight of each passing second. He thought of his father, of his brother, of the Queen, of his children, and of the future that awaited him. A future that now seemed uncertain, precarious, and fraught with public scrutiny. And then, as the first lights of London approached the horizon, the full gravity of what awaited him hit Harry like a physical blow. The palace had prepared for every eventuality. Security protocols would be enforced. Legal documents would be presented. Media contingencies would be activated. And he, the Duke of Sussex, would have to face the reality of being stripped of all that he had ever known, all in the glare of public attention and family expectation. This flight, initially conceived as a swift return home, had become something far more consequential, a journey into confrontation, into history, into the eye of a storm that few could imagine. And as the plane descended toward Heathrow, the Duke understood, with a sinking certainty, that the next moments would not just challenge him, they would define him forever. The wheels of the jet touched down on the damp tarmac of Heathrow, the plane rolling forward with a mechanical precision that contrasted sharply with the chaos awaiting inside. Outside, the night was alive with lights and activity, yet nothing could have prepared Harry for the storm of anticipation, tension, and scrutiny that was about to engulf him. The emergency flight had brought him back to the UK, but the moment he stepped off the plane, it became clear that the royal decree stripping him of every title, every privilege, every symbol of his identity, was not just a legal action. It was a spectacle meticulously orchestrated by the palace. As the plane slowed to a stop, a contingent of palace security personnel formed a perimeter around the jet. Cameras, long lenses poised from a distance, flickered in and out of focus, capturing every subtle movement. Social media alerts buzzed simultaneously, fueled by leaks from insiders already aware of the situation. Every royal commentator, blogger, and reporter online sensed that history was about to unfold, and they were eager to document it. Yet, none of the journalists would see what Harry would experience inside the palace grounds, a confrontation that would forever redefine his life. The cabin doors opened, and Harry stepped onto the tarmac. The night air, cool and heavy, hit him like a physical wave. Security officers guided him carefully through the lit pathways, ensuring that no unauthorized eye glimpsed his approach. He could see flashes in the distance, the faint glow of cameras, the silhouettes of press tents erected in anticipation. The reality was overwhelming. For all his experience navigating media storms, nothing could simulate the immediacy of arriving at Heathrow under these extraordinary circumstances. The palace had orchestrated a controlled chaos, balancing security, secrecy, and public spectacle with the precision of a military operation. Inside the private royal transport vehicle, Harry sat rigid, hands gripping the armrest, eyes darting to the briefings laid out by his aides. He was instructed on what awaited him: a formal palace reception in which the king's legal and personal advisors would present the documents confirming the stripping of his titles. Aides reminded him that he would not be alone in facing this reality. The legal team would document his responses, security would enforce order, and any public statements would be controlled and strategically released. The weight of the impending confrontation settled over him like a storm cloud. Every second on the road from Heathrow to the palace felt stretched, distorted by the gravity of the moment. Traffic lights blurred as the car moved steadily, yet inside the cabin, time seemed to slow. Harry's mind wandered to the past. Interviews that had sparked controversy, public statements that had alienated family members, and private disputes that had somehow leaked into the media. Each memory now felt like a misstep, a decision that had built toward this precise moment of reckoning. Could he have acted differently? Could he have negotiated or softened the blow? The answer, he realized, was no. The palace had anticipated every possible response, every argument, and every plea. Outside, London slept obliviously. The city lights reflected on rain-slicked streets, casting an eerie glow over the vehicle carrying the Duke. Yet the press, hyper-alert to even the slightest hint of movement, began to speculate wildly. Social media was alive with rumors, speculation, and anticipation. The palace had ensured that the story would leak in measured doses, just enough to keep the public on edge without revealing the full details. Harry was acutely aware of this manipulation. Every tweet, every news update, every whispered conversation added pressure, adding to the weight of history pressing down upon him. At the palace entrance, security protocols intensified. Guards in formal attire and tactical gear stood in rigid formation, creating a human barrier that separated Harry from the public and from the cameras. Aides guided him past the checkpoints, verifying identities, scanning for security risks, and ensuring that the environment remained fully controlled. The contrast was stark. Outside, a frenzy of curiosity and speculation. Inside, rigid order and deliberate control. Harry felt the duality acutely. The chaotic world outside, and the meticulous, almost surgical precision of the palace preparing for his arrival. Once inside, he was led through a maze of corridors, each step echoing with a foreboding resonance. The walls, adorned with portraits of past monarchs, seemed to judge him silently. Each hallway, each gilded archway, each polished floor reflected the weight of centuries, reminding him that this institution was older, more resilient, and more unforgiving than any scandal or public controversy. He was no longer merely a son, a husband, or a public figure. He was a subject of history, standing at a threshold that could alter the course of his life and legacy forever. Then came the first confrontation. A senior palace official, one of the king's most trusted aides, met him in a dimly lit reception room. The tension was immediate, electric, almost tangible. The official handed him an envelope, thick with documents, each page detailing the legal, financial, and symbolic consequences of the royal decree. The words were precise, unemotional, yet carried the weight of centuries. Titles revoked, privileges terminated, public duties suspended, financial oversight imposed, security measures altered. Every aspect of his identity as a royal had been assessed, documented, and formally nullified. Harry's reaction was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and defiance. Could this be real? Was it truly happening? In the most formal and unforgiving way imaginable? His aides whispered quietly, reminding him of the legal and procedural framework that backed this unprecedented action. The palace had prepared meticulously for his arrival, anticipating every potential emotional, legal, and public response. And yet, despite their preparation, there was a human unpredictability in Harry's reaction. A mix of anger, fear, and despair that no protocol could control. In the background, whispers of press leaks began to circulate. A tabloid photographer had managed to capture a glimpse of the official proceedings, enough to spark speculation across social media and international news outlets. Every message, every notification, every alert compounded the intensity of the moment. The palace had intended for Harry's arrival to be controlled, but the public's awareness, even at this early stage, added a new dimension of chaos. Harry realized that this was not just a personal confrontation. It was a public spectacle, unfolding in real time, with consequences extending far beyond the walls of the palace. As the evening progressed, he was escorted to a private room where the king's legal advisors, security officers, and aides awaited. Here, the gravity of the situation crystallized. The documents outlining the revocation of titles and privileges were reviewed in meticulous detail, each clause a reminder of the irreversible nature of the decree. Harry listened as legal terms, historical precedent, and formal language outlined his new reality. There was no leniency. There was no negotiation. The decision had been made, and the consequences, both symbolic and practical, were immediate and sweeping. Even in this controlled environment, the human element could not be ignored. Harry felt the weight of judgment, not just from the king, but from the aides, the legal team, and the historical legacy of the institution itself. He was being measured against centuries of tradition, weighed against the expectations of monarchy, and confronted with the consequences of personal choices that now intersected with institutional authority. Every emotion, every heartbeat, Every second was magnified, amplified, made urgent by the knowledge that history was watching, recording, and judging. And yet, as he prepared to face the formal proceedings, one thought dominated his mind. This was only the beginning. The palace had orchestrated an arrival, a confrontation, and a legal decree with surgical precision. But the aftermath, the media fallout, the public scrutiny, and the personal reckoning were still ahead. Every step he took from this point would be scrutinized, dissected, and debated. And in this controlled chaos, the Duke of Sussex realized that the emergency flight, the midnight arrival, and the carefully orchestrated palace chaos were only the first chapters of a story that would define him, and perhaps redefine the monarchy itself. But what Harry would encounter inside the palace, the moment that would pit him directly against the king and force him to confront his fate, would surpass everything he had imagined, and no one could predict the fallout that was about to unfold. The heavy oak doors of the palace swung open, revealing a room bathed in the muted glow of chandeliers, their crystal prisms reflecting the weight of centuries. Prince Harry stepped inside, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors, each one a reminder that he was about to face a confrontation that had been decades in the making. The room was silent, but for the faint hum of air circulation, the subtle shuffle of papers, and the taut breaths of aides and security personnel positioned around the perimeter. This was not a casual meeting. This was the moment when the king's authority, formal and unyielding, would collide with the Duke's personal history, legacy, and defiance. At the head of the room, King Charles III sat with measured composure. His posture was straight, his eyes steady, yet the aura of controlled authority radiated outward, a tangible force that seemed to press against the walls themselves. The Duke's heart raced, his pulse a relentless drumbeat against his chest. He had imagined countless scenarios of what this confrontation might look like: arguments, appeals, negotiations, but nothing prepared him for the tangible weight of history, power, and expectation that filled the space between them. The king's voice, calm yet authoritative, broke the silence. "Harry, sit." It was not a request. It was an order. Harry complied, aware that even the smallest gesture would be scrutinized. Around them, aides and legal officers observed closely, taking notes, ready to document every word, every reaction, every subtle inflection. This was not just a conversation. It was a formal presentation, a historical record, and a personal reckoning, all rolled into one. By the authority vested in me as king, and after careful consideration of recent actions, communications, and behaviors, it has been determined that your royal titles, privileges, and honors are to be revoked, effective immediately. The king stated, each word deliberate, each phrase weighted with the gravity of precedent. The room was thick with tension. Harry's mind reeled. Could this really be happening? Every instinct told him to argue, to plead, to explain. But he quickly realized that the palace had anticipated every possible defense. Legal advisors presented documents, each page a meticulously detailed account of the events, statements, and communications that led to this unprecedented decision. As Harry skimmed through them, his chest tightened. Every past interview, every controversial public statement, every perceived slight or act of rebellion had been catalogued. The palace had constructed an ironclad case, blending legal authority, historical precedent, and personal evidence into a narrative that left him little room for maneuver. He realized, with a sinking certainty, that this confrontation was not about persuasion. It was about formalizing consequences, documenting compliance, and asserting authority. For the first time, Harry saw the full extent of the palace's preparation. Security personnel flanked the room, their presence a subtle reminder that this was not merely symbolic. Legal officers took notes with quiet precision, ready to certify the proceedings as official. Every gesture, every word, every movement was being observed, recorded, and archived. It was a demonstration of the monarchy's unassailable power, a calculated exercise in control designed to enforce obedience, assert authority, and set an example for anyone considering similar defiance. Harry's mind flashed back to childhood memories within these very walls, holidays, ceremonies, lessons in protocol and duty. Those memories, once warm and comforting, now felt like chains binding him to a destiny he had spent years resisting. The contrast between his rebellious spirit and the unyielding weight of tradition was stark, almost brutal. He realized that the king's actions were not merely personal. They were institutional, designed to reinforce the authority of the crown and maintain the integrity of a centuries-old system. As the presentation continued, Harry's emotions fluctuated between disbelief, anger, and sorrow. He thought of his wife, his children, and the public persona he had built in exile. How would they perceive this confrontation? How would the media frame the story? How would his legacy be interpreted in the aftermath? These questions, though peripheral to the immediate confrontation, weighed heavily. The palace had orchestrated a scenario in which every action, every reaction, and every facial expression would become evidence, not just of compliance, but of character, judgment, and loyalty. The king spoke again, breaking into Harry's reflections. You have had the opportunity to act differently, to respect the responsibilities of your position, and to consider the implications of public actions. Yet, despite counsel and warning, the decisions made have left the institution with no choice. The words were measured, precise, almost surgical in their delivery. They struck Harry with the force of inevitability. There was no negotiation, no appeal, no room for delay. The decree was absolute. The authority of the crown, exercised decisively and without hesitation, was now tangible, irreversible, and confronting him directly. Harry attempted to respond, his voice tense but steady. I understand, but surely there's room to discuss, he trailed off, realizing instantly that any attempt to negotiate would be met with the same calm, unyielding authority that defined the king's presence. The aides shifted subtly, a reminder that the room was designed to ensure compliance, not debate. Every word, every hesitation, every gesture was being monitored, and any defiance would be documented as part of the formal record. The conversation, formal yet personal, delved into the specifics of the decree. Titles revoked, privileges terminated, security arrangements altered, financial oversight imposed. Every aspect of Harry's royal identity was being dissected, catalogued, and nullified in real time. The emotional weight was nearly unbearable. Harry felt the past decade of choices and actions condense into this single, irrevocable moment. And as the legal and procedural details unfolded, he realized that the palace had left nothing to chance. Every contingency had been anticipated, every possible argument preempted, every potential appeal neutralized. For hours, the room was a tension-filled theater of authority and defiance. Harry listened, responded, and absorbed the enormity of what was happening. The historical significance, the personal ramifications, and the public spectacle all merged into a singular experience of confrontation. He felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, regret, and helplessness. The weight of history, tradition, and institutional authority pressed on him relentlessly. And yet, beneath the surface, a spark of determination remained. A need to understand, to process, and perhaps, in some way, to reclaim agency over a situation that had been orchestrated down to the finest detail. As the confrontation drew toward its formal conclusion, Harry realized the full scope of what the palace had achieved. This was not merely a stripping of titles or privileges. It was a demonstration of authority, a preservation of tradition, and a public declaration that even a prince is not immune to the consequences of actions deemed unacceptable by the crown. The emotional intensity, the historical significance, and the institutional precision all combined into a moment that would resonate for decades. And just as Harry was beginning to process the implications, the king leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed and unwavering. There is one more matter to consider, he said quietly. The words hung in the air like a blade, slicing through the tenuous calm. Harry's heart sank. Even after hours of confrontation, after absorbing the full weight of the title stripping, there remained a revelation, a hidden layer, a final detail that had yet to surface. The room held its breath. Every aide, every legal officer, every security guard was acutely aware that the next words could redefine the evening, the confrontation, and perhaps Harry's future. And in that suspended moment, Harry realized that the full story was far from over, that even as titles were revoked and privileges stripped, the consequences, and the secrets yet to be revealed had only just begun. The room had barely settled after the initial confrontation when the king's lead legal advisor stepped forward, carrying a thick folder that seemed heavier than its physical weight. The papers inside were meticulously organized, bound with the precision of centuries-old protocol, and stamped with the official insignia of the crown. Harry's eyes followed the advisor as he approached, a sinking feeling crawling up his spine. This was no ordinary briefing. This was the formal legal codification of what had just been verbally declared, the stripping of all royal titles, honors, and privileges. Every word, every clause, every line had been drafted to leave no room for ambiguity, argument, or appeal. "Your Highness," the advisor began, voice calm, yet firm. "The following documents outline the legal framework, the ramifications, and the enforcement measures for the revocation of your titles. It is imperative that you review them carefully. They have been vetted through the highest levels of palace and crown law." The papers were slid across the polished table, and Harry picked them up with a trembling hand. The weight of history pressed down on him, not just metaphorically, but in the cold, formal reality of ink, signatures, and legal jargon. The first section detailed the revocation of the Duke and Earl titles, the symbolic titles that had represented his identity, his role, and his legacy within the monarchy. The language was precise and absolute. Effective immediately, all peerages, styles, and official designations held by Prince Henry Charles Albert David, Duke of Sussex, are hereby revoked, nullified, and removed from all official registries and records. Harry's mind reeled. He had always known titles were more than words. They were identity, history, and responsibility rolled into ceremonial honor, but seeing them formally erased in black and white made the reality unavoidable. Next came the privileges, a list that read like a catalog of everything he had assumed was permanent. Security detail arrangements revised, official residences and estates reassigned, public appearances no longer sanctioned under royal authority, and even access to certain funds frozen pending review. Each line carried practical consequences that reached into every corner of his daily life. No longer could he rely on the prestige or protections his position had granted him. Every legal safety net, every institutional support, every buffer against media scrutiny or personal danger had been methodically dismantled. The financial implications were next, and they hit like a physical blow. Trust funds, previously allocated for his security, personal expenses, and charitable activities, were frozen, their disbursement now under direct oversight of the crown. Legal fees, previously covered, would now fall to him personally. Any residual revenue streams tied to his royal status were suspended. Even investments connected to titles or ceremonial roles were reassessed. Harry's eyes flickered across the lines, and a cold realization took hold. This was not just symbolic punishment. It was a full-spectrum dismantling of his institutional and financial identity. As he digested the enormity of the documents, the advisor continued with legal precision. There is no appeal in the traditional sense. The revocation of titles and privileges is supported by precedent, royal prerogative, and binding legal frameworks. Any attempt to challenge this without express permission of the crown will be subject to further review and potential legal consequences. Harry's mind raced. Could this be enforced internationally? Would foreign courts even recognize the legitimacy of the crown's decree? The advisor's calm responses made clear that such questions had already been considered, anticipated, and legally addressed. The emotional weight of the legal reality was compounded by the precision of the language. Words such as hereby, irrevocable, nullified, and enforceable appeared on nearly every page. This was not a letter of reprimand, a formal suggestion, or a private warning. This was a decree, issued from the highest authority in the United Kingdom, documented and enforceable. The papers in his hands were more than ink and paper. They were a binding statement of the monarchy's will, and Harry felt the full magnitude of its power pressing down on him. Harry's aides remained silent, recognizing that words could not mitigate the impact of the legal documents. Even his closest confidants, who had supported him through years of media scrutiny, financial planning, and personal challenges, could not soften the blow. The legal bombshell had landed, and it was absolute. The Duke's gaze flicked back to the king, who sat with unwavering composure, the very embodiment of measured authority. There was no malice, only decisive enforcement of prerogative. This was not about personal grievance. It was about institutional survival, control, and the preservation of centuries-old tradition. The legal advisor moved to the next section, public representation and ceremonial duties. Harry would no longer be able to act in any official royal capacity, including attendance at state functions, patronage of charitable organizations, and ceremonial appearances. His prior endorsements or recognitions, granted as part of his royal status, were now formally invalidated. Every aspect of public life tied to his royal identity had been assessed, documented, and withdrawn. The implications were staggering. Every appearance he had made, every public association he had nurtured, was now under scrutiny, with the potential for historical record correction, revision, or repudiation. Even private actions were subject to oversight. Communications, previously afforded privacy under the umbrella of royal privilege, would now be monitored and assessed under legal and security protocols. Confidentiality, once assumed in personal and professional matters, had been diminished by the revocation. The advisor's words were clear. All communications, both domestic and international, may be subject to review to ensure compliance with the legal framework established by this decree. Harry's mind spun. Every phone call, every email, every message could now be considered part of an enforceable record. Privacy, autonomy, and security, all were altered, irrevocably, by the legal framework now presented to him. The room seemed to shrink around him as the advisor continued detailing the potential consequences of noncompliance. Failure to adhere to these conditions may result in additional legal actions, including but not limited to financial penalties, formal censure, and further restrictions on personal and public activity. Harry's pulse quickened. He realized that even inaction could carry repercussions. There was no neutral ground. Every choice, every movement, every word, and every silence would be assessed under the weight of this legal mandate. And then came the final section, the most severe. Future rights of succession and representation. Harry's position in the line of succession was formally altered. Any ceremonial, financial, or public privileges tied to succession were reassigned or rescinded. This was more than punishment. It was a redefinition of legacy, an alteration of the very fabric of dynastic continuity. The documents explicitly stated that any attempts to assert these rights without the express approval of the crown would be considered a breach of royal prerogative and enforceable under law. Harry's breath caught. This was not merely about titles. This was about history, legacy, and identity, all in the hands of one decisive authority. For the first time, the full scope of the palace's calculation hit him. Legal precision, historical precedent, financial enforcement, public scrutiny, and institutional authority all combined to create a scenario where the Duke of Sussex had minimal agency. Even the flight that had brought him back, the secrecy, the loyal aides, and the security arrangements could not mitigate the impact. The palace had engineered a scenario where the legal framework, the historical weight, and the public spectacle intersected, creating a perfect storm of consequence and authority. Harry closed the folder, a tremor in his hands, and leaned back. The reality was undeniable. He was facing the full force of institutional authority, codified in a legal framework designed to leave no room for negotiation, interpretation, or delay. Every decision, every public statement, every action taken in recent years had led to this moment. The legal bombshell was complete, absolute, and inescapable. But even as the gravity of the documents settled over him, a small, uneasy thought emerged. Could there still be more? Was there a hidden layer, a secret contingency, or an additional measure that the palace had yet to deploy? Harry realized, with a mix of dread and anticipation, that the legal bombshell was only one facet of a multifaceted confrontation, one that would test his resilience, his judgment, and perhaps the very limits of his identity. And as the advisors left him with the weight of the legal reality, the Duke understood that the next phase, the public reaction, the family fallout, and the media storm, was waiting just beyond the palace doors. What came next would challenge him in ways he could not yet imagine, and no one could predict the consequences that would ripple across family, institution, and public perception alike. As the palace doors closed behind Harry, sealing him into the formal process of title and privilege revocation, the world outside erupted. Within seconds of the first leaks, social media platforms exploded with speculation, outrage, and disbelief. Hashtags began trending almost instantly. Hashtag Prince Harry Crisis. Hashtag Royal Titles Revoked. Hashtag Sussex Emergency. The Duke of Sussex had returned to the UK under extraordinary circumstances, and the press had caught wind of every fragment of information that had leaked from palace insiders. The magnitude of the legal bombshell had sent shockwaves through tabloids, news outlets, and royal commentators worldwide. From New York to Sydney, television screens flashed the breaking news. The palace had ordered an emergency recall of the Duke, stripping him of all titles, privileges, and ceremonial responsibilities. Talk shows and royal blogs dissected every element, hypothesizing motives, speculating on fallout, and debating what this meant for the monarchy. Commentators reminded the public of Harry's previous controversies, his exit from royal duties, Netflix deals, and public interviews, and framed this as the culmination of years of escalating tension. For Harry, the realization that his private confrontation had already become a global spectacle added an almost unbearable layer of pressure to an already volatile situation. Inside the palace, aides worked quickly to contain the information, managing leaks while also preparing official statements. Yet controlling the narrative was proving nearly impossible. Private messages between insiders had already found their way into the hands of journalists. Speculation ran rampant. Some claimed this was a punishment for Megxit and the Netflix deals. Others suggested it stemmed from newly uncovered communications or financial missteps. Even without the full details, the public was forming opinions, and social media amplified every rumor with lightning speed. Harry's anxiety escalated as he imagined the barrage of questions, criticisms, and interpretations that awaited him once the official announcement went public. Across London, reporters camped near the palace, eager to capture the first glimpse of the Duke after his emergency flight. Cameras were positioned strategically to catch every possible movement, while journalists waited with the anticipation of hunters tracking a rare and dangerous prey. Royal insiders whispered that palace security had gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent leaks, but the information had already escaped into the public sphere, spreading like wildfire. For Harry, it became immediately clear that no matter what he did inside, the world outside was already reacting, forming judgments without context and projecting narratives he had no control over. Meanwhile, the social media storm took on a life of its own. Fans and critics alike debated the severity and fairness of the king's decree. Memes emerged within minutes, satirizing Harry's predicament with a mixture of humor and scorn. Opinion pieces and viral threads dissected his every move. His flight back to the UK, the secrecy of the operation, the historical significance of the legal revocation. Analysts began weighing in on long-term consequences for the monarchy, for public perception, and for the Duke himself. The frenzy was global, instantaneous, and relentless, and the palace knew it had become a story bigger than any single press release could contain. Inside the palace, Harry tried to remain composed. He moved from room to room, guided by aides, briefed repeatedly on security measures, and reminded of the legal framework that constrained his every action. But the hum of social media updates, the notifications from his private channels, and the distant flashes of camera lenses pressed in on him psychologically. He realized that this was no longer simply about titles or privileges. It was about narrative, perception, and control. The public's gaze was unyielding, and the palace had anticipated it. Every move he made, every expression, every word would now be interpreted, dissected, and amplified. Analysts on television framed the event as unprecedented. Headlines screamed, "Royal authority enforced. Duke of Sussex stripped of titles. King Charles acts decisively against Harry. Monarchy faces public scrutiny as Prince returns in crisis." Each article, each broadcast, added to the pressure, creating a feedback loop that intensified both public interest and Harry's personal anxiety. Even friends and allies outside the UK reached out cautiously, aware that any public support might be misinterpreted or used against him. The isolation of the Duke in the face of a worldwide media storm became starkly apparent. As he sat in a secure room, aides monitored the unfolding public response. Every tweet, post, and news story was logged, analyzed, and categorized. The palace's crisis management team was working overtime, attempting to shape the narrative while the story spiraled beyond their control. For Harry, the scale of the situation was overwhelming. His private life, his legal status, and his identity as a royal were all under global scrutiny. Every comment, every image, every speculation now contributed to a story that would define his public image for years to come. The frenzy was not limited to the media. Public sentiment was erupting in forums, message boards, and social media comment sections. Supporters of the Duke lamented the harshness of the king's decision, framing it as excessive and punitive. Critics portrayed him as reckless, irresponsible, and deserving of the decree. Memes and commentary flooded the internet at unprecedented speed, blending fact, rumor, and satire into a chaotic narrative. Harry, despite the palace's best efforts, could not escape the immediacy of this public scrutiny. Even legal analysts joined the conversation, speculating about the enforceability of the king's actions outside the UK, potential international implications, and long-term consequences for the monarchy. Discussions ranged from security to finance to dynastic rights, each adding layers of complexity to an already tense and multifaceted crisis. The Duke was now at the center of a storm that was global in scale, historical in significance, and deeply personal in impact. As the hours passed, the palace remained on high alert. Legal advisors continued reviewing potential scenarios, aides coordinated with media teams to manage leaks, and security personnel remained vigilant. Harry, meanwhile, could only watch the unfolding chaos with a mixture of frustration, fear, and disbelief. The media frenzy, once a distant concept, had become a tangible force, pressing in on him from every angle. He understood, with stark clarity, that the next steps of his life, every legal decision, every public statement, every private conversation, would now be filtered through the lens of global scrutiny. And then, just as he thought the intensity could not increase, the first significant leak hit the press. Details of the legal and personal consequences reached tabloid journalists who had been tracking every rumor. Headlines declared that not only had Harry been stripped of titles, but that his financial arrangements, security privileges, and ceremonial responsibilities had also been nullified. Public reactions were immediate, polarized, and intense. Social media was ablaze. Some expressed outrage, others mockery, while analysts predicted long-term implications for both Harry and the monarchy. The frenzy was instantaneous, unrelenting, and impossible to contain. Harry realized that this was only the beginning. The media storm, once ignited, would continue to grow, fueled by speculation, insider leaks, and public fascination. Every moment of his return would be scrutinized, every reaction analyzed, and every expression interpreted. The palace had anticipated some level of public attention, but the global reach and intensity of the media frenzy surpassed even their careful preparations. For the Duke, the consequences were immediate and unavoidable. And as the first live broadcast showed images of the palace, the jet, and the approaching public spectacle, Harry knew that the media frenzy was far from over. Every outlet, every commentator, every social media user was now a participant in the unfolding drama. The public, the press, and the palace had converged into a single, unstoppable force, and Harry was at the center of it all. The palace walls had barely absorbed the shock of the media explosion when another wave of tension rolled through the corridors. This time, from inside Harry's own circle. The world outside was spiraling into speculation, but the real storm was gathering privately, quietly, and dangerously among the people Harry believed he could trust. Because when a crisis hits at this scale, the first question isn't what the world thinks, it's who stands with you and who stands back. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than betrayal. Harry sat alone inside a secured palace room, the faint hum of security radios echoing beyond the door. His phone, normally buzzing with constant messages, was eerily quiet. No statements of support from friends. No reassuring messages from allies. Just unanswered calls and delivered but not read texts. The isolation that had settled over him earlier was now taking shape, not as a feeling, but as a reality. And as he scrolled through message after message without reply, a chilling realization surfaced. He didn't know who was still on his side. His team, once confident, outspoken, and eager to defend him publicly, had gone silent. Advisors who had encouraged bold moves, press strategies, and public revelations were now nowhere to be found. Even those who had once insisted they would always be with him seemed suddenly unreachable. Harry felt a knot forming in his stomach. Was this fear, self-preservation, or something worse, abandonment? Meanwhile, inside the palace, whispers had already begun. Senior aides discussed which members of Harry's circle might attempt to intervene, leak information, or spin sympathetic narratives. The palace wasn't just stripping Harry of titles. It was isolating him strategically, ensuring that he would enter the next phase of the process without external influence or media manipulation. Every incoming call was monitored. Every potential meeting was screened. The message was clear. No one, not friend, advisor, or ally, would interfere with the crown's decision. But outside the palace, reactions from Harry's inner circle varied dramatically. Some were stunned into silence. Others scrambled to distance themselves. And a few, sensing opportunity or self-preservation, began quietly leaking selective details to journalists, details only insiders would know. Harry hadn't even processed the full consequences of the king's decree, and already, the people closest to him were choosing sides. The first sign came when a longtime friend contacted a royal commentator, claiming to be concerned about Harry's state of mind. The message was framed as support, but to anyone who understood media strategy, it was something else entirely, a preemptive attempt to protect themselves by shifting the narrative. Suddenly, headlines appeared suggesting Harry had been warned for months, that his inner circle had tried to prevent this crisis, that they had advised him differently. None of it aligned with the truth, but the damage was done. Harry learned of the leak within minutes. A palace aide entered the room holding a printed headline, laying it gently in front of him. He scanned the words, and a cold wave washed over him. The betrayal was subtle, wrapped in concern and anonymous sources, but unmistakable. Someone close had chosen the moment of his greatest vulnerability to protect themselves at his expense. His jaw tightened. If even his trusted allies were stepping back, what did that mean for the road ahead? Meanwhile, other reactions were more complicated. Some friends wanted to reach him, privately, quietly, off the record, but palace security blocked every attempt. Every call was screened, every request denied. Harry felt the walls closing in. The isolation was no longer emotional, it was enforced. The message hit him harder than any legal document. In this moment, he stood alone. But the most painful silence came from one person he never expected, an old friend who had once stood beside him through the darkest public storms. Harry reached out repeatedly, calling, messaging, trying to hear even a single word of reassurance. Hours passed. No reply. Just stillness. And in that stillness, Harry felt something inside him shift. Not anger, not panic, but a quiet acknowledgement that his world was changing faster than he could hold on to it. While Harry grappled with isolation, the palace continued its internal assessment. A confidential report circulated among senior staff, analyzing who in Harry's network posed the greatest risk for leaks, crisis amplification, or public retaliation. Names were reviewed one by one. Some were flagged as potential threats. Others were monitored for communication patterns. The crown was not taking chances. This was not just about titles. It was about control, containment, and preventing the crisis from escalating into global scandal. But not everyone had abandoned him. A small handful of allies, people outside the usual spotlight, were stunned into action. One contacted Harry's security team, demanding answers. Another attempted to fly to London immediately, only to be advised against it. A third reached out through a back-channel palace contact, insisting that Harry not be left to face the situation alone. Their efforts were genuine, but powerless. The palace had built a wall around him, and no one could penetrate it without approval. Harry's emotions shifted rapidly: confusion, frustration, disbelief. How could people who had once fought beside him now hesitate, retreat, or disappear? Was loyalty conditional? Were alliances real only when life was calm? For the first time, he questioned not just his position within the royal family, but the foundation of every relationship he had relied on since stepping away from royal duties. And then came the twist no one expected. Late in the evening, as palace staff prepared for the next phase of the process, a private message reached Harry through an encrypted channel. The sender was someone he had not spoken to in months, someone he had once considered an ally, then a rival, then something in between. The message was short, almost cryptic. You're not being told everything. Be careful who you trust. Harry stared at the screen, the words pulsing like a warning. What wasn't he being told? Who was withholding information? And why reach out now, at the exact moment he was most isolated? Before he could respond, another notification appeared, not from the same person, but from an unidentified source. This one included a link to a breaking news alert. When Harry opened it, his breath caught. The headline suggested that confidential palace communication